Hello, good evening, and thanks for tuning in to Sunday Night Live. I'm David Mintz from Shrubbery Shul. This evening, we are joined by members of Steam Court, Holy Law, Whitefield, Mead Hill, and Heaton Park. So, welcome to all of you as well. Before we get started, may as well shamelessly plug my ridiculous mustache is only here for another few days, ladies and gentlemen. So, anybody looking to donate to that very worthy campaign, the link is on screen now. This evening, we've got far more serious things to discuss, I'm afraid. I am joined this evening by Amanda Bonstick and Dave Rich, both of the CST. Amanda is the North Regional Director for the CST, and Dave Rich is the Director of Policy. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us on.
Pleasure, real pleasure. Okay, so we've been having a series of discussions with various different people. Last week we were looking at domestic abuse, and you can imagine these aren't necessarily topics that we want to necessarily have to discuss, but they're very pertinent and the things that need to get addressed. And I think one of those things that affects us all so much especially within the Jewish community, and especially now more than ever, is the issue of security and how we protect ourselves going forward. And the CST has become, I think it's since 1994 where they sort of really achieved charitable status, but it's become at the forefront of everything that we do in terms of securing our communities. I recall years ago, I mean, this is before the CST became the machine it is today. But it was, forgive me for saying this at the time, this is pre-1994 probably, had a bit more of a Dad's Army sort of feel to it, because it was very much fueled and funded entirely by volunteers. And everybody was doing, it was an extension of what shuls had been doing for years in terms of supplying their own congregants to provide extra security, but actually sort of formalizing the CST took it to another level entirely. And today it's almost unrecognizable from where it started out. So tell us a little bit about that evolution of how the organization's grown.
Okay, so as you said, we took charitable status in '94, and we developed 2 offices, followed by a 3rd office. So we have our head office in London, and we developed our Northern Regional Office, and we now have an office in Leeds. And we basically, as an organisation, cover everywhere there is a member of the Jewish community, however small that community is, from the top of Scotland right down to the bottom. I mean, I'd say exclude Cornwall, because there aren't too many Jews living in Cornwall that we're aware of. But anywhere there is a community, there is representation from CST. And we have developed, we've grown, and we now have sort of 90 plus staff. But we still are a volunteer-based organisation. Without the volunteers, we wouldn't exist. And that includes our donors, our volunteers, and the shul security officers. So we're very much dependent on the community. And we say, as much as we are a professional organisation, we couldn't function properly without the amazing work of the volunteers. So that's still the case, obviously a little bit more professionalised. And as you sort of said, a machine, but a highly oiled professional organisation that encompasses every level that you would need to run such a big setup these days.
Because it is all encompassing, isn't it? When we look at it's easy for us to sort of concentrate on security and think it's just about our shul, or it's just about a one-off event that's being run. But it's present in all facets of our daily life. So yes, it's the shuls, but it's also schools. It's also organizations that are running one-off events. There's a lot going on, isn't there, simply across all the different communities. So it must take a great amount of time and effort to get that coverage out there. And anybody that's been sort of stood outside a shul on Yom Tov, even on a professional basis, and not just skiving the prayers, you'll see members of the CST patrolling pretty much hand in hand with the police. So talk to us about that, because that's an interesting relationship, isn't it? The CST as a almost like a community security organization has, together with the police, who are a direct receipt of public funding, and yet you guys work pretty close together, don't you?
We do. It's a relationship that is absolutely at the heart of everything we at CST do, because we want to work hand in hand with the police, in partnership with them and with the Jewish community. And I think the police have come to understand over the years that having a partner like CST that is from the community, that has volunteers embedded in the community, but also works closely with the police, really enhances their work and their ability to protect the community and also to work with the community. It allows us to act, for example, as advocates for people who've experienced anti-Semitic hate crime, and to represent them and to make sure the police are investigating properly, but also to explain to those victims of hate crime what's going on with their investigations and explain the criminal justice process to them. And it's a relationship that works really right from the very senior levels of police forces across the country, right to street level. We couldn't protect our community without it, and we think the police value it greatly as well.
And then it's something that they value also from an intelligence point of view, because you've got people on the ground within communities that get to hear things firsthand, and your ability to report to the police and to share that data with them must be something that they've missed out on for years, but now that's the missing piece to the puzzle almost.
It can be at times, and that's part of the relationship that we spend so much time working on from all levels, like you say, from senior levels, from chief constables, dealing with counter-terrorism, and dealing very much so with our local community officers, wherever that might be in the country. And as I'm sure Dave will touch on, we have an incredible side of the organisation, which is the policy and defence, which supports the security. I mean, fundamentally, we are an organisation that is for the security of the community, but being allowed to do that, and what ensures that we do it in the best possible way, is that we have an incredible policy and defence team who are constantly monitoring and allow us then to liaise and share as and when when it's appropriate.
So I guess coming round to the policy side of things, and perhaps a bit more your sort of area of expertise, Dave, but I know that you've currently got a book out at the moment, The Left's Jewish Problem, available in all good bookstores, by Dave Rich. But it's a book that focuses on the far left and their effect on politics, but also how it plays into anti-Semitism. And I suppose something that has been, it's probably very prevalent during the Corbyn era at Labour, and everything that UK Jewry has had to go through in the past sort of 3 or 4 years in terms of this, it's suddenly becoming okay to say certain things out loud that were not okay to be said out loud maybe sort of 5-6 years ago. All of a sudden, it returned to our campuses, it returned to our streets, it returned to protests, and it was in the front pages of the newspapers again. And as much as a good old-fashioned Jeremy Corbyn headline used to sell newspapers, let's not belittle at all in any way the effect that momentum and perhaps the Corbyn era had on anti-Semitism, how it was faced, how it then played out on a weekly basis for you guys, and in terms of the sort of things that you were seeing on the streets and also on campuses. So just maybe tell us a little bit about how that evolved.
Well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you the last 5 years, with all the problems of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and all the public debate and really heated arguments around that anti-Semitism and around Jeremy Corbyn, it was a really uncomfortable period for the Jewish community. It's not a position that any of us would want to be in, where one of our main political parties, and particularly the leader of that party, stand accused, we thought quite rightly, of being involved with or encouraging anti-Semitism. And we've now seen the Equality and Human Rights Commission has actually ruled that the Labour Party even broke the law by discriminating against its Jewish members under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. This is something that's been bubbling up on the extreme left for many years. We know that anti-Semitism always exists in the extremes of politics and in extremist movements. Jeremy Corbyn had been around for many, many years. His record was very well known. We'd written about him in previous CST reports well before he became leader of the Labour Party. So he was a known quantity, and it was really quite predictable that when he became leader, it would lead to an increase in anti-Semitism in the party. I don't think any of us quite saw how bad it would get, and just how painful those years would be for Jewish people in the Labour Party and for the community. And just to stress, we at CST are not party political in any way. We work with politicians in every mainstream political party, and we really value the fact that fighting anti-Semitism should not be a party issue. It should be something that every political party should be able to sign up to. So being in that situation over the last 5 years was quite unique, quite unprecedented. I think the Jewish community actually stood up very well for itself in making our feelings known. And I think if you look at the leadership of the Labour Party now, I think they understand how the Jewish community feels about all of this and are trying to put things right. They've got a very big job on their hands, but I do think they're trying. But I think what this comes back to is, at CST, we always say it's not our mission to talk about anti-Semitism as much as possible and get everyone else talking about it. Our mission is to facilitate Jewish life so that Jewish people all over this country feel safe and confident to live whatever Jewish life they choose to live, however they choose to live it, and not have to worry about anti-Semitism. And the fact that over the last 5 years, anti-Semitism was repeatedly on the front pages of newspapers, it was leading the news on TV, it was argued about at Prime Minister's question time in the Houses of Parliament. This isn't something that we wanted, it isn't something that we invited, but it was a problem that we had to confront. And I think I think when the Equality and Human Rights Commission issued their report last month, where they found against the Labour Party, they found the Labour Party had broken the law by discriminating against Jewish members. It really validated what a lot of us in the Jewish community had been saying for many years, but it also gives a framework for the Labour Party to move forward now. I saw the Jewish Labour Movement had a full-day conference today where Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner and lots of other Labour politicians spoke. And it's really good to see them working together again, and hopefully can mend heal a lot of the wounds that opened up over the last few years.
And I'm presuming that it also shifted the battleground a little bit, in as much as it shifted where the battle was fought. So yes, we're used to seeing certain things on our streets and in our communities, but there's an online element nowadays that has to be factored in terms of what's going on out there in social media, and it allows people to say things often anonymously, which makes it that much harder to put an end to it. But I'm presuming your work as an organization has also had to shift to have more of an online focus in terms of where you are patrolling, if you like, and in those circumstances, what are you able to do? What are you able to facilitate?
If you look at every terrorism case that goes through the courts now, whether it's jihadist terrorists, from supporters of Al Qaeda or ISIS, or whether it's neo-Nazis, there's always an online element. They're online, they're on social media, they're in chat rooms. That's where they're getting radicalized. It's where they're sharing their material. It's where they're networking with like-minded people. And that's where the investigation has to begin in terms of protecting the Jewish community and trying to predict who it is that might attack us and how and where and when it might happen. That's all online, and a huge amount of our research effort now in terms of that front line for the community is online. But also in terms of what we were talking about with the Labour Party, so much of the anti-Semitism we saw in that context was on Twitter, it was on Facebook, a lot of it, or YouTube, these other platforms. And these are places where there are extremists who are spreading anti-Semitism. But these are also the places that we all are, and our children are. Right? So this has a direct impact on Jewish people every day. We work very hard to try to encourage the social media companies to do better. We were very pleased when Facebook finally banned Holocaust denial, which is something we've been lobbying for many years. We're now working with them to actually try and make sure they enforce it. Because it's one thing having the rules, they need to actually enforce them. But you're absolutely right. So much of where anti-Semitism is nowadays, it's online. That's where it happens. And that's also where Jewish people see it and are hurt and offended by it.
Yeah, extremely prevalent, and it's just another layer of anti-Semitism that we'd never had previously, because the technology wasn't there to facilitate that sort of dialogue. And so with all the good sides of social media, you also get all the bad side, which unfortunately is all the vitriol that we see online. I mean, Twitter, for some reason, tends to be a very unhappy space where you can go and basically pick a fight with anybody that you like, and it seems to be very prevalent over there. But it goes on to Facebook and everywhere else, and as you say, it very often goes hand in hand with conspiracy theories such as Holocaust denial, and the other conspiracy theories which are well known in terms of Jewish power and our collective abilities to control certain things. People feel that we have too much control over banking industries or the press, and so these are anti-Semitic tropes. But it's much easier for these people to get them out there into the public narrative and to have it discussed. Do you think that events like Brexit, because Brexit for a lot of people very divisive subject when we come to our country, but it also started to coax out that narrative of immigrants representing a certain class of people that certain political parties would rather not be present in the country. And obviously with a community such as ours, we are effectively, whatever it is, third, fourth generation immigrants. We have to be more mindful than most that entering into that debate can sometimes be a slippery slope. But it allowed, what I tend to find locally is that it allowed people to say things that they may have been afraid of saying a few years ago, because you would have, you wouldn't have wanted to have been politically incorrect about these sort of things. But in this case, I found as well that whole debate on immigrants eventually you do end up talking about ethnicity, and you do end up talking about the loyalties between country and loyalties between religion, which has always been part of that debate that the left is so happy to sort of stoke up. So I guess there's a load of different problems over there. But do you feel that was something that facilitated that kind of talk?
I think any kind of situation where there's huge change, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of anger about that change, and also a lot of confusion and maybe fear or anxiety about the future. We all see a rise in conspiracy theories in situations like that. I'm talking about throughout history. You always see a rise in scapegoating of minorities, and you tend to see a rise in xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is the case going back centuries. Now, even if these issues have nothing to do with Jews, the Brexit debate had nothing to do with Jews or anti-Semitism, and there were Jewish people on both sides of that debate. The rights and wrongs of Brexit are not really the issue. The issue is the amount of heat, the amount of emotion, and the amount of anxiety that you see in society and in these debates. And there'll always be a spillover into anti-Semitism at some point, coming in either at the margins or much more mainstream, as we've seen. And I think you're right, that lifting of the taboo, that people suddenly felt emboldened to say things that previously they might have kept to themselves or only said at home. And now they're saying it on social media or on the streets or in the workplace. We definitely saw that, and it affected not just anti-Semitism, but lots of other types of hate crime as well.
Yeah, so hate crime is one of those things. It's a phrase that we're very much familiar with nowadays, but again, was something that never really used to exist back in the day. We just didn't have the words for it, but we've got around to labeling it more efficiently. But hate crimes can take a number of different forms. But more recently, and I think more worryingly, if we look at what's been happening abroad, in terms of the level of hate crimes and the kind of hate crimes being carried out, they can very quickly meander into extremely violent acts of targeted terrorism. So I think one of the things that initiated our discussion on these topics was obviously the recent Vienna attacks, and before that, there were attacks in Germany that we saw, and there's been attacks in France that are almost too numerous for us to even pay attention to now, because it happens quite frequently. And we also had, let's face it, not just these outlying areas where they may have tensions between immigrant populations, but you've got places like America where these sort of mass attacks that we've seen more recently have been stoked up by not just sentiment on the left, but also on the far right. So we are bang in the middle of a political tornado at the moment, where there just seems to be this support on either of the two extremes, and it is unfortunately overspilling into our daily lives as well. How much longer? I mean, I take it there's a great deal of work being done behind the scenes to keep us safe, and the reasons why we don't read headlines about UK attacks every day of the week is testament to the sort of work that both yourselves and the police are doing. But from looking at these sort of attacks, and some of them are copycat attacks, they very, very much do follow the same sort of lines of in terms of the political indoctrination. Is this something that you guys are basically dealing with on a daily basis? How real is that threat to our community?
I'll try and take it over. So I think the threat is extremely real, and it's not going away. I think the what we've seen in Europe, and we have seen attacks in the UK. We haven't seen a direct attack that actually took place in the UK against the Jewish community in regards to a large terrorist attack, but we have seen some quite big thwarted attacks against our community, and specifically in the Manchester community, that we were very thankful that the police managed to get to it before it became a physical attack. But that could have been, as bad as you've seen in Europe. So we strongly believe that the threat is there. It's not going away anytime soon. It gets emboldened, I guess, every time another attack happens in a different country. And then, as I think we touched on earlier before we came online, was about the Vienna attack, and how every time there is an attack that specifically mentions the Jewish community or a synagogue, how that then grows into a bigger potential threat for us here in the UK or for any other country. Because as soon as you mention the word synagogue, you get, and again, it's back onto the online community, you get the positive and you get the negative. You get the horror side, that wishing people to be well, but you also get the well done, great opportunity, go out there and do the same. And that's where we immediately have to look at those sort of threats, assess them, see if we feel the rhetoric online is going to impact on us here in the UK, and we start increasing. The work's always taking place, but we may start increasing our communication with the police and looking at how we need to increase physical security directly after it, as well as the constant sort of 24/7 machine that is the online way that we monitor things. So it definitely has a large effect on us.
So I take it you're actively involved in sort of reassessing the threat levels at any one stage in time. The UK government recently upgraded the level of threat based on recent attacks abroad. Are we we're seeing things now reach its highest level? I mean, we called tonight the ever rising threat, and we questioned whether or not that was the right sort of title. Was it too controversial? Was it factual? but it has been factual, hasn't it? The threat has never receded. It's only grown over the past few years.
I think we have been at one slightly higher, but the level we're at, certainly for ourselves as an organisation, we are on sort of not the highest, but almost the highest, which is the same where the UK is at the moment. With regards to sort of joint assessments, we don't necessarily, we get to find out when everybody else gets to find out. We may have a little bit of a heads up, but we strongly believe that the threat was around, obviously the potential of copycats, but also with everything that's going on with COVID and the nighttime economy and, lots of different things. And as soon as you see one attack, you often see copycats or similar or lone wolves that try to replicate or take that opportunity. So for us, the level has to remain high, which is why we're constantly talking to the community, to the schools, to the shops, to everybody. It's not going away. Doesn't mean you can't enjoy your lives, but you have to be conscious of it and do everything you possibly can to keep yourself safe.
So when we look at the CST, and let's face it, it's sometimes seen as a very mainstream organisation, but you're non-denominational, really, aren't you? In effect, you represent the entire community, regardless of how religious, traditional, irreligious they may be. What would you say your relationship with what very often is termed as the Haredi community? You're still working with those communities as well, presumably.
Absolutely, we work as you said, we're a-religious, apolitical. We work with everybody. It's just as important for us to have those relationships. And in some ways, you could say that the Haredi community are a more visible community. So that means it's even more of an issue for us to ensure that we have those relationships and that we work as closely as we can. Sometimes there are challenges, of course there are with everybody, but it's absolutely imperative that every section of our community feels that they can come to us, we can go to them, and we offer the same service to everybody.
Fantastic. We touched very briefly there on COVID. Every organisation in the country has been having to, I think the word we used again last week was pivot, in terms of get themselves into a more of an online presence in terms of their communication with their members and also the people that they serve. But there's been some real challenges. So not least, obviously, keeping a track of organizations that are open, not meant to be open, but are open and may be open, all of these different things that we have on a daily basis to really sort of factor in. So talk to us about some of the challenges that you've had during COVID and how you've managed to overcome those.
I think it was a challenge, but we as an organisation have the ability to instantly flip to working out of the office, and that's part of our contingency planning. So we're well rehearsed on having no access to an office and therefore able to work from home or wherever, and that's all our offices. And we're also, if one office wasn't able to work, the other. So we were very lucky, and we're literally within a couple of days, all staff were able to give the same level of service from home. Obviously, the challenge was some of the locations you might not be able to have contacted, but we feel quite strongly that at no point did we ever have a less of a service. We had to adapt and change the service because there was less physical need because the schools were closed and the schools were closed. But during those times, we monitored more online, and we looked at ways that we can come out stronger, especially with training, where normally we do a lot of face-to-face training. We've used the power of Zoom and Teams and all those things that we all sort of just tinkered with slightly, and actually we've been able to offer most phenomenal program of training and resources online that we were forced to do, but actually has been a really, really positive thing. And even when we go back into the offline world, we will certainly be continuing that, because that also allows us to reach our small communities and offer training and talks like this to people who would normally not have access to it. So we've taken the positive.
because we can sometimes forget about those outlying communities, but there are pockets of Jewish communities deposited all over England, in some fantastic locations. And I guess one of your challenges is to keep making sure that they're connected to the rest of us in terms of protection and getting the same benefit that we all must get.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely right. Sorry. No, I was going to say it is, and people, Jewish people in kind of outlying communities are potentially more vulnerable if they do experience anti-Semitism, and there isn't a large community to give them support. We also have seen attacks on synagogues in places like Exeter, where a far-right extremist tried to set fire to the shul last year and went to prison. And if we were trying to predict, where in the UK is a neo-Nazi going to try and burn down a shul, you wouldn't necessarily choose Exeter as your first choice. But the point is these attacks can happen anywhere. So our security provision and support has to stretch across the whole of the UK and really reach Jewish people wherever they are.
And how instrumental is the CST in helping the police to secure those prosecutions? Are you involved in the legal process of pressing charges on behalf of communities, or is that something that is left to somebody else?
Well, it's the police and the CPS between them who will press charges and prosecute. But we will give whatever support we can. So there have been cases where we provided evidence, where we provided witness statements, either with the primary evidence that we've found or has been reported to us by a member of the community, or where we've given expert witness statements about why something is anti-Semitic or the impact it can have on the community. And those kind of community impact statements are very important. But we've also helped the Crown Prosecution Service to design specialist training for hate crime prosecutors across the whole of the UK on prosecuting anti-Semitic hate crime. Because again, a lot of prosecutors might be in parts of the country where they don't see many cases of anti-Semitism. They don't necessarily recognize the kind of language and the symbols that we would all recognize as anti-Semitic. So we help them to design training for that. So there's lots of different ways in which we will give them support, or they will come to us and ask for advice on particular cases so that they can push them through.
So there's almost an element of cultural awareness training that goes on there as well, in terms of them becoming familiar with the sort of things that we are all too familiar with. We're getting some great questions coming in, so we'll start to address those. Would you like an easy one or a really difficult one?
Start with a level one and we'll work our way up.
We'll start with a level one. Here we go. Phil Cohen, good evening, Phil. Thanks for joining in this evening. Phil Cohen has got his question in part here, but I'm interested in how you support the mental health stroke mental well-being of your frontline staff, given how stressful this work must be. Yeah,
absolutely. Really good question, and something we have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years. We'll be honest that we didn't necessarily realize how big that issue was, but certainly in the last couple of years, lots of our staff have received specific training. We have access to a helpline. We have access to psychologists and psychiatrists that the staff can have sessions with, and we have really sort of moved forward with that in the last couple of years, and accept that can be an issue, because especially if you're working in the policy and defence and you're seeing some quite nasty stuff regularly, so that support is there, and it's also there from peer to peer as well. So we've taken that very seriously, and hopefully I think we've done really well with that at the moment.
That's great. Jane Johnson, good evening, Jane. I've been wondering how lockdown and COVID measures have impacted on the threat and security. Possibly the risk of people being radicalized is higher, but is policing now easier?
I think there's definitely an issue of people becoming more radicalized. There's definitely been an increase in conspiracy theories around the vaccine, around COVID. And anytime you kind of go deep into the conspiracy theory world, you always hit anti-Semitism pretty quickly. Again, it's one of these situations where the whole world's been turned upside down. People are very scared. and that's when extremists really feel that they can recruit new people and spread their message. And of course, a lot of people are just stuck at home for much longer, and therefore on the internet for much longer, and that's where all the extremism and all the radicalization takes place. But then the other side of it, as Jane's question says, is the policing changes because there aren't so many public events. We've had to adapt our security operations to reflect the fact that schools are closed or are open in different ways. Some people are holding minions in the open air. The whole policing of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the other Chagim was completely different from how it normally is. So we've had to adapt. We've also seen, anti-Semites are kind of opportunists. And we've seen a whole new type of anti-Semitic incident called Zoom bombing, where people kind of get the login details for Zoom meetings, and they come in and put anti-Semitic comments or shout anti-Semitic things in the service or the meeting or whatever it is. And there's been quite a few shuls and other kind of Jewish educational events that have been targeted in this way. So we've had to develop a whole set of security guidelines for how to hold a safe online event, which is something that wasn't really an issue for the community before. Yeah. So we've had to adapt, definitely. And as we move back, hopefully, offline and into our kind of former communal lives, as hopefully next year things improve, we'll have to shift again.
To good old-fashioned anti-Semitism.
Well, it's the same old ideas. They just find different ways to express them and to target people. And we always have to try and be one step ahead.
Okay, so here's the more difficult one, because I suppose it's so all-encompassing. But Clive Barkley has asked, anti-Semitism is like an endemic worldwide virus. What is organizations like the CST doing to try and rid the world of this disease? Are you working on a vaccine, guys?
Yeah, it was called Dave's book.
yeah. There's no vaccine for anti-Semitism, unfortunately. But it would be a lot easier.
It's a really good question, though. You mentioned Dave's book in terms of answering that kind of anti-Semitism, but how important is production of literature at that sort of level that not only gets a message out to the wider public? Yes, I'm sure you'd love people to buy copies of this and to read it, but it does a basic job, doesn't it, really, in terms of phrasing that debate to people who are not familiar with the sort of things that we have to deal with. They may not know the difference between good old-fashioned anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism posing as anti-Semitism, or vice versa. These days, it's very difficult to have one without the other. So I'm presuming a lot of that policy work and a lot of the kind of the literature that is produced by organizations like yourselves and also individuals like yourselves is important in fighting the battle.
You're absolutely right. Education is a really important part of this. We do all our security, we support hate crime victims, all of that. That's all very reactive. We also need to be trying to reduce the problem. And the way to do that is to educate people about how to recognize anti-Semitism and about why it's wrong, and how to have decent kind of policies and structures against it. So we have our youth wing, Streetwise, which educates Jewish school children about not just anti-Semitism, but a whole range of issues. But Streetwise also has a program called Stand Up, where young Jewish and Muslim educators actually go into schools, all sorts of schools, not just Jewish schools, and educates about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred and about bigotry more generally. And they've reached thousands and thousands of kids, and they do a really good job. We also do anti-Semitism training for lots of different organizations, whether it's trade unions or campaign groups. For students, I'm giving a lecture to a criminology course at Goldsmiths University tomorrow. Always trying to spread this education, because one thing we've found through a lot of research and opinion polling we've done, there's a lot of people in this country who believe one or more anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish people, just something they've heard, that Jews are rich or powerful or that kind of thing. Very few of these people really think of themselves as anti-Semitic or want to be anti-Semitic. Very few of these people feel any hostility towards Jews. They're just believe stuff they've heard somewhere, and probably they don't actually know any Jewish people because there aren't that many of us, and we're not really spread that evenly around the country. So I do think as a community, educating people, finding partners, people to work with outside the Jewish community, a lot of it does come back to social media and working with the social media companies to try and reduce the spread of anti-Semitic ideas, because social media does so much to spread those views and to help the anti-Semites do their work. So we need to make sure that those platforms are actually working with us against them. Bit by bit, it's like the question says, anti-Semitism has been around for a very, very long time. And we might not necessarily, find the cure, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reduce it as much as we can.
Absolutely. You touched very briefly on some sort of interfaith collaboration there. And we might be forgiven sometimes for ignoring the wider world and thinking that hate crimes only exist within our sphere of influence, but they're out there for other communities as well. You mentioned the Muslim community there in terms of the problems that they have experienced, and I think they also report a marked sort of increase in those sort of incidents after there's been some sort of an attack. And very often people are out there looking for scapegoats, and it's something that they have to put up with, and it's something that they have to deal with. But how much work does the CST have to do in an interfaith context to work with other organizations? And are there other organizations? I'm presuming we have our Community Security Trust. Is there the Muslim equivalent?
So there's a Muslim organization called Tel Mama that monitors anti-Muslim hate crime that we actually helped to set up, and we've advised them, when they were created and throughout their existence. We work very closely with them. All minorities experience hate crime and discrimination of different kinds. We have a lot to learn from each other. We also have a program called SAFE, which stands for Security Advice for Everyone, where we actually teach other faith communities how to do security at their places of worship. And again, we've given talks to literally hundreds of representatives of mosques, churches, gurdwaras, other faith institutions, to try and spread that knowledge, and also in doing so to build those relationships as a Jewish organization helping other communities, and to try and build those bonds and therefore form these structures against all types of hate.
We obviously talked about the challenges during COVID, but one of the clear challenges for all charity organizations or community-based organizations during this time, and let's face it, it's a time of economic hardship, whichever way you look at it. Even if certain people have managed to get through it so far relatively unscathed, it's likely to get more difficult for people as a whole. So giving to charities isn't necessarily the first thing on your mind when you've been furloughed or your future job prospects are in question or whatever it may be. So obviously there's been a very severe threat to fundraising efforts. You guys would normally hold a sort of annual dinner, which was always very sort of high profile. You had a number of different guests that have attended your dinners to speak in the past, home secretaries, etc. So, these are hugely important events, both in terms of raising wider awareness, but also in raising funds. So how does an organization like yourself adapt to not being able to do those things?
So I think we took the decision early on to sort of step back slightly from fundraising, because we recognised that we were able to continue functioning at the level that we were at, and that some of the maybe more the sort of care-based organisations became more in need of funds. But obviously, as this has taken longer than maybe any of us had an idea it was going to be, we are now obviously looking at developing different strategies around fundraising. We have continued to fundraise, maybe not as much in the public eye, but certainly we are about to develop that and having to move into that and find alternative ways. Like you said, we do obviously do the annual dinners and the events, but we also have other means of fundraising. We do direct fundraising and other ideas like that. So it will be a problem moving forward, and we will be needing to fundraise. I'm certainly not going to make an appeal tonight, because but moving forward, we definitely need to look at alternative ways on how that's going to be, and I think that's the same for all community organisations. But we do recognise that it's going to be a challenge. There's been some fantastic support within the community that's come direct to us, even though we haven't asked, and we really appreciate that. We have done some small direct campaigns that have done really well, but it's going to be a challenge for all communities, and I think it's something that we have to all share in. Other like-minded people in different organisations are getting together to talk about these things, and hopefully we'll come through this and develop a sort of for the next couple of years.
I think there are some real anxieties amongst those organisations that have been present in some of those discussions, and it's tough to make an ask for something without which, let's face it, all of these organisations, we spoke a few weeks ago to the Fed, who require a vast amount of money to come in from members of the public in order to sort of fill that deficit from what they receive publicly and what they're able to do. And I'm sure your organisation's no different to that. So we'll look at how that evolves over the next few months, because as we start to come out of COVID and we start to rebuild our new lives, we'll probably take back some of the personal space that we've managed to grab in terms of, this is lovely. We can talk to each other over Zoom or StreamYard, over whatever it needs to be. We don't have to travel to each other. And Dave, you're probably in London at the moment?
Yeah.
Right, there you go. So, able to join us this evening quite easily. Whereas in the past, we always used to sort of think about how to get in front of one another. And I think some of that will stick with us, and we'll have to sort of, we'll have to adapt to that. Got some more questions coming in. Phil Cohen, do you get involved in any mediation between the victims and the offenders?
Very much so. There's a process called restorative justice, which was actually championed here in Greater Manchester a couple of years ago. I think it's actually adapted its name slightly, but depending on the level of the incident, and usually, and I don't like the term, but a sort of lower level, or perhaps definitely a first-time offender, or perhaps a younger person who has committed an offence. There is often an opportunity for victim and perpetrator to meet and to mediate, and there's a few of us who have done the training in that, and we'll basically sit in a room together with the victim, the perpetrator, the police, and ourselves, and we'll allow a quite open, frank conversation between the perpetrator and the victim, and it's often even more powerful than potentially a sort of a slap to wrist or a minor caution, because you'll find that the perpetrator doesn't always understand what they've done, or realise that throwing an egg and shouting Hail Hitler or something to that person, how it's affected them. And when you actually get the victim explaining how that made them feel, and how their grandparents or their parents, or they were, first or second generation, we've seen occasions where, the perpetrators have been crying and highly apologetic. We've also seen it not work as well, but on the whole, that option is a really good way for the sort of smaller offences that we hopefully would stop people going on to doing something bigger. And then obviously when things have gone further and they've gone to the court, as Dave mentioned before, we are able to submit evidence, give statements on behalf of communities, and support victims.
Fantastic. Okay, a question or comment here coming from Shifra Mintz. Good evening, sis. I was listening to a podcast debating how polarized this country really is. Some research they were talking about shows that 97% of the political social media is posted by only 2% of the population. I sometimes wonder if social media makes things seem worse than they are. and hateful attitudes we see online are not as prevalent as they are in real life. Anecdotally, my experiences seem to be so, and most people are apathetic or just plain ignorant. So how real is it? Is it overstated?
It's definitely the case that social media exaggerates division and rancor, and that's partly because people who feel that way feel really het up, go on social media to express it, but it's also because that's the model that social media companies use. You know, Facebook and Twitter, they want people on there arguing because they want to keep people on the platform for as long as possible to sell their data to advertisers, basically. And the thing that keeps people, I mean, all the research shows the thing that keeps people on their platforms for longer is confrontation and argument. So that's what social media is built for. And it's absolutely the case that most people in this country don't think about this stuff very much, aren't politically engaged at all, don't really pay that much attention. Certainly on our issues, most people in this country never give Jewish people or anti-Semitism any kind of thought at all. And certainly, you know, when everything was going on with the Labour Party, the Jewish Leadership Council and other Jewish organisations did a lot of polling and a lot of kind of focus groups to find out what most people thought. And most people in these groups had never heard of anti-Semitism, could barely pronounce the word. It just wasn't on their radar at all. So there's absolutely no doubt. We live in a bubble, right? We're in a Jewish bubble. We're in a bit of an anti-Semitism bubble, and social media really exaggerates all of that. And actually, you know, your sister is right. If you get out there and just talk to people, most people don't care about this stuff or just are generally decent.
Yeah, my sister's normally quite a level-headed person, but then she'll throw the odd question in like this: "What are the CST doing about the prevalence of extreme moustaches?" Don't answer that question. It's clickbait.
We're on the case. We're on the case. We have somebody to your premises. If you hear a knock on the door, I suggest you open it, Mr. Mintz.
They're coming for me now. I can hear them. Just before we let you go, obviously world events. You know, you probably read things in the paper on any given day and think, God, that's all my job's going to be about for the next week. So obviously in the papers recently, we've had the US elections, and again, a very divisive debate out there in terms of which camp you fall into, whether you are a Trump supporter or not, how great he is for the Jewish community or how great he isn't. There are those debates going on there, but they have a knock-on effect, don't they, in terms of maybe not instantly, but there is a wave of hate that sometimes can reverberate around the world. And is it something that organizations like yourselves have to keep on top of?
You have to, even if there's no direct impact here, and obviously the identity of the president of the United States has no direct impact on us, but it sets the mood and the mood of politics in general, and especially the mood of extremists. So what we're looking at is not necessarily what Donald Trump or now Joe Biden, when he becomes president, says from one day to the next, but how extremists in this country react to it. So when the US presidential election happened, we were looking very closely at whether it was stirring up any kind of anti-Semitism or any kind of expressions of violent intent amongst extremists of any type in this country. Again, when the terrorist attack in Vienna happened, we were looking, through the night at what were extremists in this country saying about it. Was anyone saying they're going to go out and do the same kind of thing? So it's always about what will the impact be here that actually affects us and our community. That's really where our focus has to be. The rest of it is kind of background mood, if you like.
Noise, as we call it. Right, Jane Johnson has commented, Facebook has double standard when it comes to freedom of speech and anti-Semitism. Until recently, Holocaust denial was allowed, but didn't allow criticism of a Palestinian cause. And again, that's where a lot of the tensions online tend to rest. Are you finding that the debate always comes back to Israel, or is that something that is it sort of 50-50?
It really varies. It really varies. One of the things which is kind of chilling in a way is how much of the anti-Semitism that we see is not about Israel, but is just the old-fashioned conspiracy theories and kind of blood libels, Holocaust denial, that kind of thing. Really much more obvious and overt types of anti-Semitism. Look, we've worked with Facebook and the other platforms for years from a position where when they began, they just thought they had no responsibility whatsoever to police what was on their platforms, to a point now where they accept they do have a responsibility, and they do remove a lot, to be fair, but we're trying to get them always to recognize anti-Semitism more and remove more and be more effective in doing it. So, for example, as well as banning Holocaust denial recently, Facebook also banned conspiracy theories about Jews running banks, Jews running the media, that kind of thing, which is great. Firstly, we want to see it enforced. And secondly, well, what if someone writes Zionists run the bank? Zionists run, Israel controls the US government, that kind of thing. As far as we're concerned, that's just as anti-Semitic. But it's about getting the platforms to recognize that kind of language. So it's a slow process. We'll keep at it, and the progress is always gradual, and there will always be double standards and always places where in one area they've made an advance, but in another area they haven't caught up yet.
Okay, well, you've almost made it through a full hour of this, so I'm going to let you go and enjoy the rest of your evening. But before you do, in terms of volunteers and how people can support the CST going forward, I'm presuming you're always constantly recruiting and on the lookout for people that have the right particular set of skills to help you guys out. So how can people get in touch with you?
How can they get in touch with us? They can call us, they can email us, they can tweet us, they can everything. It's very easy. Just Google CST and the CST.org comes up, and there's a volunteering page, there's a giving page, there's a sharing information page, there's reporting anti-Semitism, which is just as equally important. So we're out there in all forms and all social media platforms. So follow us. We have a CST Manchester, we have a CST national account, and I have a little bit of a sab of my own account. Feel free to follow. Obviously not many people
on that account, by the way.
And with regards to volunteers, we're always looking for all sorts of support, even if they've got dodgy moustaches, Mr. Mintz.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for joining us this evening and giving of your time to talk about your vital work and a subject matter that unfortunately affects us all on a daily basis. But it's nice to see that there are dedicated professionals out there looking after us. So thank you very much for coming on board. Thank you very much for tuning in this week. Next week, we will be talking to Jewish Action for Mental Health about their experiences during COVID. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week.
Thank you.